Hi everyone, welcome back to another Oxford Schools debating workshop. I'm Patrick, another one of the CAs for the competition, and this is our sixth workshop in this series. If you haven't watched any of the previous workshops, I highly recommend you do. They're on our YouTube channel. If you haven't, that's completely fine. Today, we're going to be discussing preparation time and essentially how you can sort of effectively use it and structure it so you can basically winning the debate before you even begin. Right, just a bit of a roadmap on what I'm going to be discussing today. First, on structure, that's sort of how you should sort of structure your prep time. Then on case construction, coming up with your actual arguments, prioritizing your time, and then preempting what other people are going to be saying. Then finally, I'm going to be talking about actually writing your speech in prep time. So some key points for that. I'm going to go through an example, and then I'm going to be talking about how sort of prep time looks for different positions. All right, let's get started then. All right, first on structure. Most times, I think the intuitive way is that when you get that 15 minutes that you allocated for prep time, you and your partner sort of just start discussing arguments, then you sort of start writing it. While this is a method that you can use, and obviously your prep time should be customized to you, how you best see it fit, there is a sort of way that I would sort of recommend you structure your prep time, and best how to effectively use it. So first thing that most people I think don't actually use at first is silent prep time. So that's say for like the first 5 minutes after you get the motion, you and your partner sort of just sit in silence, sort of start to brainstorm ideas by yourself, writing down like jot notes, writing down quick points and sort of analyzing the motion. So this could be like 3 to 5 minutes. You can start talking earlier, depending on the motion, whatever. But it's allows you time to individually process the motion so you actually understand it, and also to try to think of different arguments, because when you're sort of discussing with each other, oftentimes you'll sort of just start discussing the same arguments, get on the same track of thinking. By having sort of two independent people thinking of different arguments, you're more likely to think of more arguments, or you're more likely to think of like a better sort of view of the motion. So this I highly recommend. After that, when your silent prep is over, you come together for a discussion. This is where you and your partner exchange sort of arguments that you thought of, talking about which arguments you want to actually run for your case. It's also important to discuss what you think other teams are likely to say. And then you can also still be like writing your speech during this time. But this is mainly where like discussion is had and what you guys want to do with your speeches. I'd say normally for like opening teams, you do this till about like 10 minutes. For like closing teams, so like closing government, closing opposition, probably spending more of your prep time just doing the discussion because you don't actually need to be writing your speech. And at the moment, since you do have like half an hour during the debate, but mainly for opening teams, right, you're going to be doing this until about like 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, you get into like the final stage. That is where you're actually writing your speech until prep time is over. And so this is where you're basically just writing an argument on your sheet of paper and making sure you're prepared. It's important here to still be communicating with your partner so that you guys are on the same page, you know what arguments you're running, but you are mostly just probably going to be like writing your speech, and particularly for speakers. All right, now then moving into case constructions. So first on actually coming up with your arguments and sort of like content, generally when you sort of get a motion, you'll think of like the most obvious arguments, most obvious points in like say like your silent prep time, and you sort of come up with arguments from there. So what I want to sort of do is give you sort of more tools to try to think of new arguments. But also if you're say like a more beginner debater, just thinking of more and more ways to think of new arguments just going to be useful to actually come up with your arguments in the first place. But if you're also say like getting better, or you're a more advanced debater, thinking of more different aspects of a debate is important so your arguments are more nuanced. So both these sort of things, so this applies to sort of like both wherever you are as a debater. So for different aspects of a debate, when you're analyzing it, it's important to think of, I have like 3 things here, but just try to think of like as many things as you can. So like words in the motion, that could be particularly what is unique about the motion, or like why is this a specific thing listed? So if it's like a motion about say like movies, try thinking about like what's unique about a movie that is different than maybe something like social media or other forms of media you consume. What's different about like books? And so just trying to like focus on like what's unique about the actual motion, and that way you're more likely come up with arguments that way. Another way of thinking is thinking about actors. That is, who is involved in this motion. So it could be something like the average consumer, maybe it could be like an employee, maybe it could be like a big corporation, maybe it could be the government, maybe it could be other governments. And so here we're trying to think about like who actually is involved in this debate. And then also another way is to think of like short versus long-term effects. So just trying to think about like if this motion were to like play out for like a long time, what do we think is going to happen eventually? Another way to sort of expand where your arguments are taking place is to try to think of like other locations where this is taking place. And so I just have an example here, but you could just try thinking about like where different countries, so especially if you're like live in the UK, you might try think of it like only sort of based in the UK, but it's important to remember that this debate can take place anywhere else in the world, right? And so trying to expand your horizon as to like how this might affect, say like maybe a country that doesn't have as strong like democratic principles, whatever. What is this motion likely to look like then? Maybe it's more important actually over there. Now that we've actually thought of sort of like these ideas, how do we actually apply it to a point map? Some ideas are just like points by themselves, right? You just think it up like, oh, that's like a pretty simple argument. You'll write it down as a point. But especially as you're getting more advanced, a lot of these sort of like ideas or different actors are just sort of applying more like nuance to an argument as you're given like a more realistic account of the world, because you're sort of like understanding like who's involved better, what this is likely to look like, what the incentives are, etc. And so even if like maybe your more realistic account of the world is detrimental to your case, maybe it's not as good, it's better to have like that more realistic account. Because if you can think of, if you're capable of thinking about like something that's like realistic, that's not necessarily good for your case, the opposing team is likely to think of that as well. So if you're able to address that and say maybe this isn't that big of a concern and include it in your argument anyway, you're probably better able to make a stronger argument that's more reliable, and you've already thought of sort of like a response to it and how to sort of better strengthen your argument anyway. But now that we actually have an argument, the main bulk of it, and when we're actually going to be writing it, I'll talk about that a bit later, you're going to be wanting to think about like, one, why an argument is true, and two, why an argument is important. These are sort of like the two main things that you want to be thinking about when you're writing your argument, when you're trying to sort of come up with it in your head. And so you want to be thinking about all the logical links that are necessary for like something to be true or something to be important. And that's sort of like the two main sort of like aspects of an argument that's really important for a debate. If you want to look more about like actually making an argument, we did a workshop on it, third workshop by Drew. Excellent. I recommend you watch it. All right. But I know for a lot of people that it is just generally hard to try to think about arguments. And so I know, especially when I was doing British parliamentary debating, so when I first started doing British parliamentary, especially for like back half team the closing teams, trying to think of new arguments, new extensions, I had a bit of trouble. So I was actually taught like this acronym, Supreme, and so to try to help me think of new arguments. So S stands for social, and there's utilitarian, politics, religious, economics, military, ethics. So like social is sort of the like social justice movement, so like disenfranchised groups, how does it affect them? Utilitarian, not as clear, but it's basically just like how does this affect like an average individual? Politics, quite obvious, like governments, politicians, etc. Religious, this is like something that is like often forgotten, but particularly for like debates where like religious groups might be particularly important, maybe depending on where the context of the debate is. It's important that it's can have like a large influence over like certain actors. Like for example, if you're debating a motion in the Middle East, it's probably important you talk about like the Sunni Shia divide, etc. E, economics, once again, quite obvious. M for military. This is another thing that is like probably forgotten quite a bit, but it's just like in certain places in the world where maybe like military power is more important or holds a greater influence, it's important to talk about there. Then E for ethics, this is just trying to think of principled arguments. for the case. So also for like the obvious things like politics and economics, this doesn't just mean that like in the broad general sense, but say if you're debating a motion about like sports, sports can also affect, like say like the Olympics have like political or economical arguments. So these are just sort of things to help like stir your memory, or to try to like influence you to try to come up with new arguments. All right. Now that we actually have our arguments or have some ideas of arguments, how do you prioritize which arguments to actually do? And so since we have like a limited time, we want to be using that time most effectively. So first, about actually choosing which argument you want to run. You want to be thinking about, out of all the arguments you thought of, what is probably the best argument. So maybe this is one that's like the most believable and is like the most important. This is the one that you want to focus on. But there's other aspects. Maybe you need to assess your skills. Can you actually run this argument? So for example, me, I'm not very good at like economics. I don't really understand it that much. I don't really study it. And so a very bulky economic argument, maybe I would rather not run the argument and I choose something else to do. So you need to be quite critical of yourself. Do I think that like I'm going to be able to run this effectively? But also another aspect is just like, how hard is this argument going to be to prove? That is like, maybe I'm running out of time in prep time, maybe I only have a few minutes left, and I know there's still quite a bit of like logical links that I need to try to figure out before I can actually run this. I don't have the time for it. I'm just not going to do this. I'm going to choose a different argument that's maybe a bit easier. All right, now that we've actually chosen our argument, how do we like use prep time effectively in actually writing the argument? And so it's important to realize that certain arguments have like sort of like different burdens. And so what I mean by that is like you're going to be spending more time maybe on like a mechanism, maybe you're going to be spending more time like impacts. So for like something when you're debating about like say disenfranchised groups, right, I think it's quite obvious why it's important that those people are valued, but also so you're probably going to be spending more time on like the mechanism, maybe explaining like spending more time why it's going to be like harmful or like say beneficial to that group. That's probably where you're going to be spending more of your prep time on, since it's quite intuitive why they are likely to be important in this debate. On the comparative, maybe something when you're debating about like the environment, where it's like quite obvious, like science says that the environment is just going to get worse if we do like say like fossil fuels and stuff. But then the mechanism is to explain why maybe like a 0.5 degree increase is necessarily going to be so important, so impactful to people. So you're probably going to be spending more time illustrating impacts. So that's sort of like prioritizing within your argument. Finally, I always get like questions about like how exactly we should be prioritizing. What should we spend our time in prep time if we're say closing government or closing opposition? So I'd say like generally here, you're going to be wanting to be preparing, just trying to think of like first what you think your opening half is going to run. So at least you like have a general understanding of what is probably going to be taken, but then also just trying to think of like a bunch of different arguments or new arguments that you don't think your opening team is going to take. Alternatively, or not alternatively, but you could also be spending some time thinking about what the other team is going to be saying, then thinking about responses to them, so that you don't necessarily need to be concerned quite as much with what your opening half team has said, and then you can just like figure out your extension during the debate. And it's sometimes as like back half, you can begin like writing your argument just by thinking of like, what do I think like opening half teams are not likely going to say? Maybe this extension is quite bulky and I don't think opening government is going to have the time to write it. So I'm going to like start preparing that. Maybe not like going into fleshing it out full detail, but I'll like write a little bit so that I'm a little bit more prepared when that debate actually starts. All right, next on preemption. So this is basically where during prep time, you're thinking about like what other teams are going to be saying, and then maybe trying to think of like responses to that. The reason we do this is it makes you like more prepared if they do say in response to you, so that you then can better respond back or like rebuild or rebut, things like that. Or you can address it before it is even said. So if you know like another team is going to say something, maybe as prime minister, you can address and be like, opening opposition is likely going to say this, but actually it isn't as important as they are going to make it seem. So you can address it before it even begins. ultimately, like preemption is a little bit more like advanced. You shouldn't be like focusing on as first, but it's just good in general to try to think about what other teams are likely going to say. So I'd say if you're starting to sort of want to be have like a little bit of extra time, prep time, or especially if you're say like deputy prime minister or deputy leader of opposition or back half positions, this is probably what you're going to be spending more time on. And then next are so three things that you're probably going to be doing. One is think about like opposing arguments. So think about the obvious arguments by the opposing team. So this is just, and then sort of just think about responses to said arguments. Second is on rebuttal, like rebuttal towards you. So think about which parts of your argument is particularly weak or that is going to be responses to. And so here is where you're probably going to be spending some time trying to strengthen your argument. Be like, I think like the other team is going to say this about our argument, but actually it's not quite as true. And yeah, so basically strengthening your argument. Final thing is just think about like what you think your back half team might say. So if you know a particular extension is possible, but you just don't have enough time to sort of run it in your own case, you could like sort of like mention, oh, like maybe there's these other actors who are involved in this motion, but they are actually not as important as our point for like reasons X, Y, Z. And here we're basically responding to back half teams before they've even said anything. So obviously, since you don't know what they're going to say, don't spend too much time on it. But if you think it's quite obvious, you can. This is something that shouldn't be like the main focus or take away from this lesson, but sort of just something to sort of add on top. All right, next, we're going to be getting into actually writing your speech. So sort of just some general notes on writing it. First is about structure. And I don't think we've actually talked about this in any previous workshops, but how to structure your speech. First, you're going to be wanting to start with an intro. Some people want like flashy intros. That's not necessarily as important. What is quite important is that you roadmap your speech. That is, you just outline what you're going to be saying to the judges, and it makes it more clear and easier to follow for listeners. So it could just be something as simple as, first, I'm going to clash with what opening government said. Then I'm going to present our first constructive argument X and our second argument Y. Something short, something succinct, something that like it's easier for people to follow. If you're prime minister or leader of opposition, you might also need to have like a model of clarifications. Yeah. Then you're going to be getting into clash. If your role clashes, so like deputy position are probably going to clash quite a bit, things like that. I will say that like, so generally I'd say like put this before your actual arguments, except I think like for member speeches. So like if you have an extension, you should probably be doing your extension before you clash just to make sure your extension actually gets out, but it really is up to you. In terms of the actual arguments, so once again, in like a third workshop on argumentation, we sort of talked about how to structure your arguments. Let's sort of do a brief reminder. So first, you're going to want to do your tagline, and so that's just what your argument generally is. Second, on framing, that's sort of characterizing what the world looks like. Thirdly, on mechanisms, so explaining why policy X is likely going to lead to outcome Y. Yeah. And then fourthly, on impacts, why is it important? What is this likely to look like? Such as that. Right. So it's important that you actually have structure in your written speech and you're structuring your arguments when you're writing them out so that when you actually say it, your speech is more likely to come off as structured and more clear to people listening. Another key thing is don't write your whole speech. And this is particularly hard when you're first starting out with public speaking, but it's something that you sort of want to start building up. You want to sort of just be writing down things that are going to help you remember your speech, because you actually find that quite a bit of your speech is already in your head, right? Things that you've already thought of or things that are quite intuitive. And so you want to be starting to sort of build up towards like bullet points or like just sub points and minimizing how much you actually write, because it actually saves you time in prep time, and you can sort of start to think of like other things as well. Finally, on writing, when you're writing your speech, make sure to communicate. Make sure that each speaker understands what's going to be said. So like make sure like you know what arguments your partner is going to run, things like that. But also, if you're sort of running out of time in prep time, you can ask your partner to sort of help you prep. So like a first speaker can be like, hey, can you sort of write the impact of this case? I'm running out of time. And then your partner can sort of help you with that. All right. So now I just want to go through like sort of example of actually one of my own cases. So I've sort of like taken some photos of like the paper. And so this is to give you sort of an idea of what it could look like. I encourage you to sort of test your note-taking style, figure out what sort of works for you. But this is just sort of an example for me. So here is the motion in disaster-prone areas. This house would replace all state rebuilding and reconstruction efforts with direct cash transfers to affected citizens. So here I was opening opposition. Specifically, I was leader of opposition. So that's the first opposition speaker. I just included this here to show that like this is actually what my paper is. I did rewrite it with pen and made it much more clear so that's easier for you guys to actually see. So first, this is the first sheet. And so this is sort of what I did as like my brainstorming sheet. This is what I was sort of using in that sort of like silent prep time. So first we see like the motion right at the top. We can see like top left, my position 00. And so first I sort of start with disaster prone. What does this mean? Happens often. People are experienced. And so I say like not as much state. This isn't like clear. So not as much state is sort of not clear unless you are me. So I'm just sort of writing things that will trigger my memory. And so it doesn't necessarily need to make sense, just whatever helps you. Then I sort of start thinking about, oh, what is the OG model likely going to be? Right, rebuilding house since likely same cost. That's like just direct transfer enough to like rebuild your own house, things like that. And then I also question like, what about public buildings? I'm not sure what opening government is going to say. Once I've like outlined sort of like what the main parts of the debate is going to be, I start thinking about my own individual points. So I think about like, say, as contracts and contracts, sort of like flesh it out like there's like it's more efficient. And like my second point that I thought of was like state has greater incentive for local businesses. And so just like individuals are more selfish and then it's necessary to rebuild the economy. And then I do have like two other points like urban planning, communal buildings. It's not as much written here because this is sort of what like, my partner came up with and I was just sort of like writing it down as we were discussing. And then finally at the bottom, you can just sort of see, so it began to think of like some government points. Didn't write that much here, but just to show that I thought about what they might say. All right, here is where we sort of get like one of my arguments. Notice immediately in the top left corner, I write 300. That is, I wanted to get to you after 3 minutes into my speech. So the first 3 minutes would have been mostly spent on like clash and rebuttal, but I didn't really include that on the papers here since I want to focus on why I wrote during prep time. But basically, I have that reminder, I want to be here at 3 minutes in my speech. Right at the top, I have my tagline, building more efficient. Then I have framing. I have first, individuals are more selfish, give some reasons for that. And then second, state has more collected capital. This is like was it a spelling mistake, but it doesn't really matter. I don't really care because it's sort of just to trigger my own memory. So obviously you can see immediately, I'm not writing everything I'm going to say. These are just sort of things in my head. Move on to my mechanisms. So first on communication and second on urban planning. On like, if we look like at communication, so I talk about lines of communication / internet likely damaged due to disasters, people have greater stresses, right? Greater stresses here is sort of to trigger my mind. Here I'm thinking about greater stresses such as finding loved ones, getting clean food and clean water and getting food, getting shelter. These are sort of the things that are triggered in my mind when I read this. So obviously your thinking is going to be different. Just finding words that sort of trigger things in your mind so that you end up writing less and you find intuitive. Then I get on next page. So what the impact of it is likely to be: quality of life, public buildings, etc. Here is my second argument about building the economy. Once again, similar structure. I'm not going to go through it all again, but you can see like framing. I have my bullet points, mechanism, etc. And then I have like impact. Then here at the bottom, I divide it. I have like weighing. So these things are like more beneficial, especially for the poor. And here the line of reasoning is just like the poor generally will need like communal buildings more since they don't have enough money to fund themselves. So here I'm sort of just like outlining my whole speech, just sort of in bullet points. I know how to sort of think it out. I encourage you to sort of find a style of taking notes that is effective for your speech, and so to try start to building up to sort of writing less bullet points, such as you see here. Finally, for this workshop, I just want to briefly go over what different positions look like in writing their speeches. So first, on Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition, I think this is pretty clear. This is basically just what we've been talking about. Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of Opposition, you're probably going to be spending more of your prep time helping your partner, but then also preparing responses or like weighing to what you think the other teams are likely going to be saying. So that's sort of what you do in terms of writing your speeches. And then sort of like back half, so that's like member government, member of opposition, whips, probably going to be spending more time, I say, like thinking about the best vision of the debate. And that's just sort of thinking about like who are the actors involved, what is likely to be important, and like so like think about how this debate should be weighed. And so it's more like abstract parts of the debate rather than specific like arguments, but that's sort of like what you do during prep time. And then once you sort of get into the debate, then you actually like finalize your extension, things like that. That being said, members should still probably be writing maybe a little bit of the extension so that they're a little bit prepared. Or if you think like the opening half team is not going to run your extension, sure, go ahead and just write your entire extension. But to be like warned, it's really dependent on sort of what goes on during the debate. So prep time isn't nearly as important for back half teams, but this is sort of what you sort of do during that. All right. I hope this has helped you. I hope this has sort of given you an idea of how to structure your prep time and how to sort of find ways to be effective for when you're actually debating. Because ultimately prep time is pretty individual, just whatever gets you the best outcome. That being said, I hope you continue watching video series, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in the future. Thank you.